It's my honor and pleasure today to visit Dr. Bill Weber in Boulder, Colorado, who's an eminent botanist, not only in vascular plants, but bryophytes, lichens, mosses. It goes across all parts of the plant kingdom. And
birds.
And he's authored many things, and he's very rich in historical knowledge and global botany and geology. And so today we came to talk about what is a herbarium, and I think what we're going to do is let Bill just tell us the story of how he ends up at a herbarium and develops up a herbarium which has national recognition.
Okay, well, just let us first decide what an herbarium is and get that out of the way. Practically all of you have, at some stage in your early life, started an herbarium. The minute that you put a violet, and flower and leaf in a book, that is the first thing you do to make an herbarium. And that was what happened back in, say, the 1300s, when plants were very much used for medicine and food, and all of the information about such things was held by the monks and the abbots in seclusion. But the monks had to know what these things looked like, so they simply saved one of each that they could find. It was a long time, a couple of centuries more probably, before they began making beautiful pictures of all of these plants. And you can go back into the early literature and find out all about marijuana. It had a different name in those days, but you can learn there. Well, an herbarium is simply like a planetarium, a vivarium, all these ariums that you know about, and why people can't understand what the difference between all of these ariums and a herbarium are, I do not know. But herbs were what they called plants in the old days, and that's where herbaria started, probably in Italy back in the 1300s. Anyway, I want to tell you the story of my life becoming a naturalist and getting early into the herbarium business as a hobby, and actually spending all but about 10 years of my adult life at 197 right now in herbaria. Well, my first introduction to natural history was when I was a very sickly little boy. I had all kinds of things wrong with me. I had heart trouble, I had all kinds of children's diseases, and I was accident prone, and I could only recreate by sitting on the floor and building Lincoln logs and playing with little tin soldiers. My cousin was a self-trained naturalist, who I don't have time to talk about here, but he took pity on me and came over to the house one day with a simple microscope about 8 inches high, single barrel, and some prepared slides. He became a specialist in butterflies and insects, and he spent his life here in Colorado in that kind of study. Well, Brownie said he was a naturalist, so I became a naturalist at the age of 5. A few things about this early time that I remember. My first memory of botany was when my mother would knock on the pipes of the apartment, which told the gentleman on the next floor up that it was time to come down to have tea. And the man who came down was a botanist, a quite famous one, as turned out later on. His name was John Henley Barnhart. He was the what would you call it? Biographer of botany people at the New York Botanical Garden. And he had a card file which became immense and was actually published as a book compiled from these cards, which we have always used in the herbarium when we wanted to find out about some botanist before the days of Google. Anyway, I probably forgot about Mr. Barnhart. That's the only connection I ever had with him, except using his book 50 years later. My mother had to manage a brownstone house, which was one of three that my uncle, who was a doctor, owned. And my mother took care of the children there and rented out the top story. It's such an interesting coincidence that during the Depression, which was starting about then, the person who rented the room in the top floor of my mother's place was a lady called Helene Lunt. You may, if you're old enough, know all of the stories about the lackadaisical work. The workers under Roosevelt's work plans would lean on their shovels. Well, Helene Lunt leaned on the shovels of a lot of women working at the Botanical Garden, and their job was to take all of the specimens in the museum, which were simply, apparently just laid on folders of very flimsy paper, and mount them on standard I can't remember the size, but this size cardboard for permanent storage. And so she had a crowd of about 20 ladies working at a table and remounting these specimens. All of the specimens of the New York Botanical Garden were transferred that way by WPA. And you had to be very careful not to let they'd lay out newspapers, you know, and to lay the materials on. You didn't want the newspapers to have comic strips on them.
Really?
It took the energy away from the workers.
Oh.
Well, anyway, somehow or other, Helene Lunt took an interest in me. And when I was in high school, I had very wonderful teachers. Two of them I continued knowing as long as they lived. One of the male biology teachers had to take botany when he was in college, and he gave me his copy of Gray's Manual of Botany. We could have gotten it there. And Gray's Manual of Botany was like the Manhattan telephone book at the time. I was kidded about it for carrying this around with me. It was the only botany book that I knew about. And Helene Lunt took me out on weekends to a park or to a meadow somewhere in the Bronx, sat me down, and found a plant that I might be interested in, and taught me how to use the key.
Wow.
With one of the most difficult of all books that you could buy. Well, there were no easy books for kids at the time. But that's the way I learned, right at the start with Gray's manual. Well, she showed me that I should be collecting these plants and showed me that the main thing was that you had to make a plant press of crossed pieces of wood, about like that, and you had to cut blotters out of rolls of carpet padding. Carpet padding was the ideal blotter for doing this, and I remember sitting out on the back porch, my mother and I would help each other one by one, cutting these with the big scissors and making a plant press. And of course we had to have newspaper to put the plants in. So I would go out with Miss Lunt and begin to collect. That was the beginning of collecting, and it's what I've done for the last umpteen years. And most of my early plant collections are still available. They're in an herbarium somewhere. I sold some of my private collection to Ohio State in 1940. Well, I was very much indebted to Miss Lunt, and it also happened that I roller skated through Bronx Park when I went to high school, and that took me through Bronx Park, where I would meet birders, early birders, people who worked at the Botanical Garden. And one morning, I went off the trail a few feet to collect the leaf of a skunk cabbage for show and tell at high school. And lo and behold, an angry witch came running after me, sending me out of the Botanical Garden. Don't you come back. And that was the most prominent moss specialist of North America at the time, Mrs. Nathaniel Lord Britton, Gertrude Britton. Wow. Mr. Britton was the director of the Botanical Garden, and for several years I was very careful never to enter the botanical building because someone there like Mrs. Britton might recognize me. But the Botanical Museum at the time had a series of glassed-in cases with specimens of plants, and I had to see them. They were the property of the Herbarium. Well, I had my troubles not being rich enough to go to college, so I had to spend a couple of years working, and one of the jobs that I had prepared me for the future. I got a job as a $10 a week office boy for an attorney firm, just like in Gilbert and Sullivan. But this was an attorney firm that dealt with equity law, especially cases involving sewing machines. Well, the partners came to me one day and said, "Can you type?" I never saw a typewriter in my life before. "I will try." They put in front of me briefs that had to be typed 6 carbons, no erasures permitted. So I became a slow typist who never made mistakes. And that was very important. Because when I finally got to the point where I was able to go to college thanks to a friend of mine who drove me out to Iowa State, where I got it. Roosevelt put me through on the youth program, where I worked for a small amount of money, but my job was typing specimen labels for a lady who was the curator of the herbarium at Iowa State. She didn't just collect one specimen of each one. She would collect up to 30 or 40 specimens of the same plant, for which I had to type 40 or so labels. No erasures permitted. So I typed all the labels for this wonderful old lady, and when the time came, we distributed the duplicates to different museums and herbaria and sorted them out on tables with their labels and so on. So I got great experience in typing labels. And I also made a collection of the whole flora of the North Woods area on the north side of the campus, and eventually gave the manuscript to the library, where it still must be. I had to go to graduate school, they said. Now, what's graduate school? I had no idea. Well, yeah, when you graduate from college, you go to graduate school. Okay. So they gave me some papers to fill out, and in those days the papers were very pleasant because they asked you what kinds of things do you like to do? Do you enjoy sports? This kind of thing. And I tried to find out what on earth I could tell them that might help me get a position as a graduate student somewhere else. And I thought, well, when I was in high school, I had a German teacher, Fräulein Stamm, an old lady who did the wonderful thing for me by setting me up with a pen pal in Germany. And with that pen pal, who I understood at the time was one of the kids in the Hitler Jugend, but that didn't matter. His father and my father were both pharmacists. That's how they put us together. Well, I learned from his letters. He wrote his letters in German and I wrote my letters in English, and then we would switch sometimes. But I learned to read and write the old German script. Not that it would do me any good anywhere, but I wrote that down on my application to these graduate programs. It was just exactly the thing that they wanted at Washington State in Pullman, because Washington State had recently come into a marvelous collection of specimens of plants collected in the Columbia River Gorge area on the north side in Washington, near the little town of Bingen. And this collector, Suchsdorf, was a German immigrant who came out from Iowa and lived with his brothers on a farm just underneath Mount Adams. My job in the botany department, for $50 a month stipend, saw me through graduate work. And I needed to be able to read and transcribe all of the notes that the collector had made, all in old German script.
And that, is this the same Suchsdorf of Saxifraca, Suchsdorfii, and
That's
others?
right, that's right. And so I was responsible for the final job that made the Suchsdorf collection
Oh, baby.
worthwhile. Now, during the war, I was a conscientious objector, and nobody knows much about this anymore because there were few books written about it. But I was sent down to a internment camp on the south side of the Columbia Gorge, just opposite the home of the Suchsdorf family. The collector of Suchsdorf was dead by that time, but I got to know his sister and his brother. And this was a big help in that. And of course, at night, I was able to type the final copies of my doctorate thesis, which I finished in that place. And I found that the Columbia Gorge was actually a marvelous place to be, because it was loaded with mosses and lichens and other flowering plants. So, although the work assigned to me was really not very much work of national importance, but I did it, and I enjoyed the days I had free to collect. And so I collected heavily in the moss business. Well, I needed to get the mosses identified, and I needed somebody to help me. And I remembered using a little moss book when I was in Iowa. In fact, a little paperback book on the local flowering plants of Iowa, written by Dr. Connor, who was a professor at a small college in Iowa. So I wrote to Dr. Connor, and I told him that I was in this place collecting mosses and I needed help, and that I had been to school in Iowa, and I was a CO. Oh, he was so excited because he thought that he was dealing with a forester whose job it was to use mosses the way they did in Europe in establishing their forest reserves. To have an American forester studying mosses, so he came right on. He said, and then when I told him, no, I'm not a science, I'm a dumb CO, and I'm stuck down here, and I'm collecting mosses. Well, he says, wonderful, I'm a pacifist too, and in fact, I'm a Quaker, and I'd like to help you out. I'll identify your mosses, and I'll send you a little money in case you get into Portland on a day's freedom, so that you can buy a pair of shoes or have a good meal once in a great while. So we became great friends. And Connor was the moss man for anybody who was an amateur in the moss business. Because, well, that was about all there was. It's still called How to Know the Mosses. I think it's still in print.
Yes, the little spiral bound books.
And somebody else has taken it on as the author. I can't remember the name. Anyway, so then they found out down in the camp, down at Portland, that I was a botanist and that I might be able to draw pictures of plants. And so they put me on a job of illustrating a booklet on the plants of Region 6 of Oregon, which was the Blue Mountain area in the east, and put me in the field the following summer helping in the field. I'll never forget my first ride on a horse. You might understand when you think of the fact that the horse was in the barn, and I made the mistake of getting on the horse in the barn. That was the first mistake. And then the second mistake was that out in the field, I opened up a map on the horse's back, and that was very unhappy. But our job was to move, to help the grazers in the area make friends with the glaziers by helping move their cattle from one allotment to another. And this was another opportunity I had to collect plants and mosses. So I got to know the Oregon flora, I got to know the Washington flora, and I worked in the herbarium, making all those labels, and so I really had a mini career at the University of Washington State. Well, the war was eventually over, and I moved back to Iowa with my wife and family, and went back to Iowa State working in the library as a technician. And then it was a very hard job for a person who had been a CO to get a job anywhere. And so I had offers from little religious schools in California who wanted a religious person, and I was not religious at all. So I worked in Dubuque. I worked putting sash together in a window company, and finally I went back to Iowa State and got a temporary job there for a while, looking for work all the time. And finally, this job here in Colorado was the only one that was willing to take me, I guess. And they had an instructorship in the biology department. And I knew that there were specimens at Colorado, but they belonged to a private collector, Joe Ewan, who preceded me as an instructor and had left for South America to collect new sources of quinine, like so many botanists did during the war. And when I got on the campus, his collections were in the attic of the museum. So I had to prevail on Joe when he got back to America and was not re-invited to the faculty at Berkeley. This was a curious little thing because he left and expected to come back to the University of Colorado as an instructor, but he was not invited back because the Berkeley, California people had decided in the meantime that they were not about to let another classical taxonomist get the PhD at the University of California. So he was not invited back. He went to New Orleans and spent the rest of his career down there at the university. Donated finally his fabulous library and collection to the Missouri Botanical Garden, where they allowed him to spend his last years chewing the fat with students and other interesting people at the garden. So Joe Ewan actually had a wonderful career, although it did not resonate in a career in the University of Colorado. So I've been here ever since.
And how did you just started with his collections and yours to begin?
No, I couldn't use his collections. I just saw to it that he would come up and get them.
Okay. And so how did the herbarium start to grow?
Well, the wonderful thing is that I came to a university that had the potential of having a museum. At that time, herbaria were not associated with university museums. They were with botany departments. Botany departments became biology departments, then they became departments of evolution and cladistics and all of this stuff. So I worked until 1962, from 46 to 62. I was on the faculty of the biology department, working also full-time in the museum for nothing. But another very lucky thing happened was that we had this extreme crisis at the university, a political crisis that resulted in the administration leaving as a group. And it happened that the chancellor of the university was a botanist who favored the development of the herbarium and did what he could to help. Well, when the administration left, I discovered that the chancellor had transferred me lock, stock, and barrel to the museum on a salary basis. And that's the story.
So, when you began the herbarium, it was mostly your collections, or did you get?
Well, I found some collections around. In another building, which was the bacteriology building, I discovered some cardboard boxes, which were full of collections of fungi. Not mushrooms, but the flat leaf and stem fungi, which came also from Denver with the Alice Eastwood's remnants. And I found a collection of mosses, which Geneva Sayre, who had been a student at Colorado, had collected for her doctorate. There was no one to help her here in Boulder, but she had some help from someone in Laramie who knew something about paraphytes.
Would that have been Solheim? Solheim?
No, Bill Solheim only worked with fungi. And I had a very good relationship with Bill.
Would have
And
been
I got to, we haven't talked about exicati. Exicati. Exicati simply means dried ones. And Exicati are sets of specimens which are collected for the purpose of sale or exchange. And when we had this chancellor, we received some wonderful exicati which had been lost during World War I in private collections, which were later discovered at a chateau or somewhere that was not bombed out. And they were put up for sale. And Oz Tippo was good enough to furnish us the money to buy many of these exicati, which really, really were wonderful. I published my own exicati, that's exicatum, of lichens when I got into lichenology. This is interesting because I published, it's actually a publication. You publish a booklet with the labels repeated from the labels on the packets, and you can open up that box and bring in a couple of packets and I can show you what a packet looks like. Well, you can bring the boxes. This is what a moss collection looks like. Okay. You see that? Well, this is our complete holdings of a particular moss that I'm interested in right now. And this batch of about 80 specimens are all we have. But it's a remarkable collection because it covers most of the places where this particular moss has been found. Namely, one record for the United States, England, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Tunisia, East and West Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, East and West. Then we jump over to Australia, Eastern Australia. Also, the island of Réunion, where that broken airplane wing was picked up recently from the Barrett crash. And that's about it. Oh, no, I had to add Crimea, Caucasus, all places near the coast, and all places on calcareous rock, or on the bases of trees which have been bathed by blown calcareous dust.
Huh.
And that's it. Now I'm writing.
Now that's a very unusual distribution pattern.
Yes, it is.
And what might explain that?
I don't know whether I should.
Well, yeah, I don't want to pry into your top secret project.
Yeah, right.
We promised we wouldn't go there yet.
Right.
So, all right, so in a herbarium, we have the general collections. In the old days, they would be filed phylogenetically, but mostly today everything's alphabetical. And then we have
That's the problem. How do you file? How do you store these things uniformly? Now, unfortunately, America has a different size mounting paper from those in other countries.
Oh.
In Russia, in Siberia, where I studied the collections in Novosibirsk, they're not mounted at all.
Oh, really?
They're in folders of paper
Oh, really?
and just lying there.
Is that due to the economics of the cost of the paper and the mounting, or just?
I have no idea why. I imagine that the same thing was true of the New York Botanical Garden, because I can't see all of those women trying to pry loose specimens that were pasted on something. And so they probably were in folders of the proper size. But the size, it's difficult to put together a European collection and an American book. Another thing about mosses, you notice there are all these uniform packets.
Yes.
In the traditional herbaria in the eastern United States, the first specimen of the moss was on this major sheet, okay? The label was down in this corner, and the packet would be somewhere on it. You had to be careful not to put packets on the same place in succeeding. You don't want to overbalance one corner. So they began to paste packets. So as many as 12 or 15 packets on a single sheet with the label of the first packet here and the packet there. And so I don't know whether they removed them or not, but this is the traditional way. When you borrowed a specimen, you borrowed the sheet with 25 others. But that was the way it was done. The Lewis and Clark collection, I have a picture of that, the plants collected on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they're pretty fragmentary specimens. But the interesting thing was that they never opened a packet to show you what the most looked like.
You just see the packet.
You see the packet?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Seeing is believing. So maybe we should explain, like, in a description of the species, the types, and relevant to the management
The
of the
important
names.
thing is that the library and the herbarium are linked, incredibly linked, because the descriptions of the original plants are in the library, and in the herbarium you need access to them, and mostly the herbaria keep their collections of books and papers, and the library doesn't like to have collections of reprints of individual papers. So that's a thing that you have to think about if you combine in any way. But the important thing is that if the books were all destroyed, you did not destroy the specimens, you can still do it again. But if you destroy the specimens, you cannot trust the written word, because there must have been many mistakes. So a library has to be unfortunately, it's not generally, library keeps away from collections of things. And we have to work that out eventually.
So,
But at our institution, the library is beginning to realize the relationship between them and the museum.
mhm.
Now, what were we talking about?
Well, I was trying to ask like for nomenclature, names, the value of types versus general collections. Where I'm trying to go to is for those that have not been to a herbarium or understand.
Yeah,
it.
well, for every named specimen, there must, no, I can't put it that way. Every species that has been described has to be more or less officially described in a particular way for which there are international rules of nomenclature. And the type specimen is the single specimen that goes with, forever linked to the first description of the plant. And so it was fairly recently, I'd say recently within 150 years, that type specimens became so important. For one thing, the entire collection of a person who maintained a private herbarium but published could be Pouilly de Rodin, the moss collection and lichen collection of Pouilly de Rodin was at Dunkirk, and the whole thing was destroyed. Much of the collections at the Vienna Museum, which they took all of the monocot specimens and stored them in caves during World War II. And the story goes that when the armistice was declared, a group of Americans discovered the cache and built a great bonfire.
Oh,
So they have nothing left of that. So no matter how much you try to keep them, you are not sure of what you're going to face in the future. However, the next best thing is to segregate in a particular case, which should be near the door, of type specimens. The classic example was Alice Eastwood, who was the curator at San Francisco Academy of Science, and during the earthquake, she was able to run back into the building and pull out the type specimens, which she had been the only person at that time who segregated types.
oh.
She was responsible for that happening. I met her once, very briefly.
So types were traditionally not always segregated in an herbarium.
There's still problems, but it's mostly in the old cases. They're still ironing out some of the questions that have not been answered, but it's universal to types.
So for well, there's, let's say, professional botanist or taxonomist who are familiar to come into a herbarium and work, and are working on some group. A lot of the people, the majority of people we deal with are field-oriented people, not doing research in groups. Could they feel welcomed or comfortable to come into a herbarium and ask for some sort of assistance in having a specimen or something in a baggie, say, and could somebody help them get a name on an unknown plant?
We always say that if you collect something, send it to us the way we tell you to send them to us. But very, very rarely does that ever happen. Pictures are not good enough. They send us pictures of mosses. There are some very good pictures of mosses on the internet now, but most of them are not. But if you send, the curator will not be very happy if you send a picture of a moss you've seen but didn't collect, in case it would be a very great surprise to get such a specimen. So we don't mind getting pictures, but in addition to the plant.
Right, right. Now, the herbarium, unless it's an unusual collection, probably won't keep the specimen.
Well, if it's a specimen that is worth keeping, we keep it.
Okay.
But there's a protocol that you have to learn about. You know, you take a grab of something in a wet fan and squeeze the water out of it, but you don't open it up gently and let it dry normally. That's more or less of a throwaway.
Throwaway.
Although you could salvage much of it, but it would take some time.
So across the country, there's the big museums, New York, Smithsonian, Missouri Botanical, Berkeley, etc. And then generally at every state there's usually one or several good university level herbaria.
Most of the smaller ones are in trouble. Well, actually, the big ones are in trouble too. There's a great crisis building up now as to staffing sedentary collections, which nobody looks at much anymore. But you need somebody there who knows them, knows about them. And the British Museum, I understand, is allowing its faculty to grow old and retire, but not be replaced.
Mm.
And that, unless the institution is very rich, many herbaria get bigger because many herbaria die and are transferred. Now we received the complete most collections from Bill Flowers
Oh,
at the University of Utah because Utah had no use for them anymore.
Yeah.
And his wonderful drawings.
Mm.
We have the original drawings. And his field notes. So we still have Bill.
And and so I guess where I was trying to point out was that people who might need help in an identification should locate where their local herbarium or
Yeah,
whatever and make contact
of course.
and see, you know, if they can get some assistance. Okay.
And you're up against the human aspect of it.
Yeah, there's always that, yes, yes. And if they have time and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
And now there's also a difference I've encountered at certain institutions where the herbarium is now more like a museum with artifacts and you almost can't touch them versus a functioning herbarium where you can pull things out, put them under microscopes, take notes, whatever you're doing. So there seems to
Well,
be...
that has to be pretty severely supervised.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so in those cases you would, yeah, the curator.
the person wanting to study these things understands that, or should understand that.
Okay. So in, I've been to the herbarium here multiple times years ago. How many specimens are in the herbarium? Do you, well, I guess that.
Well, over 500,000.
Wow, I didn't realize there was that many. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
And how many of those?
About 100,000 mosses.
Yeah, I was gonna
And
ask.
same amounts lichens.
You're one of the few people who work beyond just
Yeah.
one group of plants.
Yeah.
Thus a very vibrant.
Yeah, you see, when I'm gone, and Ron's gone, we're the only bryologists in Colorado, and that will mean there's no help for anybody. You have to go somewhere else, and there's no somewhere else.
No, somewhere else,
Yeah.
yeah, no.
Yeah.
And so, one of the questions which I alluded to you earlier that I was real curious about, because I know in my lifetime, in my career as a botanist, I've seen taxonomy from more morphological, of course, chromosomes and flavonoids were big, and then isozymes, and right up on through now to DNA. And it's influenced the interpretation in many cases of what a species is. What would your comments on in your lifetime, the changes as you see them influencing the science?
Well, I had nothing to start with, you see. So I had to build up from the bottom. And it was a hard job because we had space problems, we had money problems, we had all the problems. But we stuck with it and worked as well as we could and made out. but it, it's a problem which simply can't be solved because you don't have the ability to mount similar situations, similar happy situations in places where there's no interest. I mean, how many states have a state herbarium?
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, how many states know enough about their, oh, and then we speak about dot maps. That's,
Oh, yes.
that's the big story now. Now Harrington was very, very good about it. He understood that a dot needs to be proven. And so he put on his dot map the herbarium that he saw the specimen at. And that's unique as, I don't know any other outfit that has done that. But there's so many mistakes in the dot maps because there's no responsibility taken by the person who makes the dot map to ensure that, especially a suspicious dot, needs to be verified. How do you know where the specimen is that someone made that dot map responsible to?
Right.
Very tough question.
Often,
And not dot maps are so ununiform now. Sometimes you just have one specimen in the state and they simply make the whole state green.
yes.
Or they put the dot in the middle of the state regardless of where the single dot is. It's not helpful, and it's not the scientific method. I mean, it's a complete degradation of the scientific method.
Often, this is a very different question, but I've often thought about this as far as maps, distribution maps, based on specimens. One example is Hultane, Flora of Alaska, where he's got all those beautiful maps of the circumpolar regions and where these plants go down through North America and Europe. I often thought to myself, not a comical sense, but in a way, too bad you couldn't make like an old flip map of all these maps, and what story would it tell, all the distribution maps?
Well, I'll tell you what happened with Hultane. When I was over there at the Rijksmuseum, Hultane ignored me at the start because I was working with lichens. And then someone put him onto the fact that I knew the flowering plants. And he was desperate, absolutely desperate in his last years to be able to make dot maps of the southern mountains of the northern hemisphere, for which he could have no way of knowing. And so one day I was joining him for tea in the coffee shop, and he brought a little bunch of small maps, and I should put dots, maps of Colorado, so that I should put dots of where I had seen. And I could do it pretty well. And that was wonderful. Because he came over here and spent some days over here in the mountains.
Oh, did he? I didn't
But he
know.
was desperate for information. Now he had a bunch of refugees from middle Europe working in the herbarium, kind of slave labor. And their job was to consult all of the botanical books and journals and so on for evidence of occurrence of species in those.
And that's the basis of his maps.
That's right.
Oh.
He wasn't looking at specimens. He had these slaves giving him information on where a dot should be.
Oh, I never knew that.
You know,
Oh, Bill.
how else could he do it?
Yeah, right.
He
That's
couldn't borrow all of this stuff he couldn't travel anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And you see, you don't know, you have no idea how a dot map is produced,
right,
or what you can trust.
right.
Oh, this recent book on the grasses of Colorado has some awful dot map mistakes in which an endemic plant of northwestern corner of Colorado is marked on the Great Plains. No evidence at all. Where they get the information, who knows?
Yeah. Another question I wanted to ask you, because I know it's one of your favorite interest areas years ago. Well, that probably still is, but in phytogeography, which I have some interest in myself, as the relationship of the flora of Russia and the Altai into the Rocky Mountains and the alpine floras and the relationships, and how does that develop? Well, I have, I'm asking that as the dummy question, how does that develop, right? But could you give a short, explanation of, how one part of another continent could have such an influence in our flora up and down the Rockies and the relationships?
Or just close the Arctic Ocean and put northern Siberia adjacent to northern Canada.
And that would have been during Pangea or
No.
later?
But who knows? I don't
Okay.
know. But it seems certain that the origin of the alpine flora is in the Alpine. And as you, Ralph, put it, the Arctic is just like an airport. All kinds of things can get moved around on the airport.
Because it's always,
We have lots of things in common, for example, between Colorado and eastern Quebec.
yeah.
Yeah. And Michigan,
Huh.
the northern.
What was that due to how it lobes these old,
We don't know about ages, we can't say,
okay,
but it seems pretty clear that Hooker was certainly right. Hooker, the father of plant geography, spent 5 days in Colorado, and when he got down to southern Colorado on the tall mountain, he said, "My God, this is an Asiatic flora."
oh, is that
Yeah.
right? Huh.
And the first indication that I had an Asiatic flora on my hands was that when Parry was out here collecting from Iowa in the 1860s, he collected what was identified as Stipa mongolica. And Mongolica?
Yeah.
Colorado? Well, I know I have seen Stipa mongolica. It's not a stipa, of course, but it's Telegrostis.
Mm.
But I've seen, well, my picture of this one. Not a very good picture, but it's rough. That could have been in Geneva Park.
And there's a young Bill Weber, a very nice photo of you. Philograsis weberi. It's Salsaria.
Yeah.
In the Altai, how about that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so Syria is a big genus all
Yeah.
through the Altai and
Yeah.
Tibet, Mongolia.
Yeah. Very nice picture. Both. That's a very nice picture of you. What about endemism, like in the Colorado or the Rocky
As far as we
Mountain
know,
flora?
we don't have any endemic mosses in Colorado.
Oh, is that right? Huh. But you have a lot of endemic, a reasonable amount of vascular ones.
And lichens.
Oh, and lichens also.
However, in many cases, we've discovered that eventually we find the Asiatic occurrence of a Colorado species.
Yeah, yeah. And you,
Like Sora japonica, for example, in Japan.
yeah, right, right. Well, Bill, you have positively, in many of your writings, from originating a herbarium to just students to things, you've left a monument of positive, informative work, which I think speaks highly of your Torah duty.
Well, that's why I think that one of the responsibilities of a scientist should be to keep alive what we know about the people who built us,
Yes. Yes.
if we do nothing else.
Yeah. Yeah. Bill, I really want to thank you. This
Well,
has been a
it's
treat.
It's always
Of course,
fun.
they missed the earlier conversation.
I love to talk to people.
Yeah, well, you have a lot, and you're very sharp. Your memory of plants still exceeds mine, so. Well, okay, Bill, I think we'll end here.
How about some coffee?
We'll go get some coffee, and I thank you again.
You're welcome.
All right.